On Nationwide this evening, we look back to Ireland of 100 years ago, when the War of Independence was raging, and when, in 1920, one of the most reckless attacks on property of that period was carried out. Guest presenter Donal Byrne brings us the story of how Cork ended up in flames on this coming weekend a century ago.
The narrative of Cork in the early part of the last century was a tale of two cities. The city was prosperous, wealth was concentrated in the hands of a small merchant and usually unionist community, while the majority of 80,000 people relied for employment on the city's distilleries, breweries, mills, foundries, and, from 1917, Henry Ford's new plant by the Lee. In the context of the British Empire, Cork was always regarded as a loyal city. Yet it was some 400 years earlier when Henry VII is reputed to have first described it as the rebel county. That was after a locally sponsored attempt to usurp his reign.
It would have been considered a very modern, commercial city, in line with many other similar sized cities across Europe and the Western world.
Down the centre of Patrick Street, you see the almost continental awnings outside the large new department stores. You see the Union Jacks flying, very much a loyalist city prior to, let's say, the 1913, 1914 period. And you see that kind of almost sort of high British city style in Cork City at that stage, but that is very much the centre of the city. What you're not seeing here is the warren of tenement streets radiating out from that commercial centre in Patrick Street or the administrative centre in Grand Parade.
While the Union initially brought prosperity to places like Cork City and we boomed in and around the area here on the butter market trade and on the shipping and on the harbour and that, the idea that all boats were lifted by the same tide, that certainly wasn't happening.
In modern Ireland, we don't really use the word slum very often, but that could definitely be applied to large areas of Cork around Blackpool, Shandon, Barrack Street, where disease, poverty, lack of sanitation, lack of actual facilities and houses, made these places quite grim.
You have people, living in very cramped conditions in one rooms in tenement buildings. Of course, you have the appalling sanitary conditions leading to those slum areas being nucleuses of, things like typhoid outbreaks, and earlier then, of course, in that century, smallpox.
For others, a great industrial and science exhibition in 1902 was an exciting diversion and attracted thousands. King Edward VII was among those who travelled to the city.
The 1902-1903 exhibition gives a good snapshot of what the wealthy and Edwardian Cork would have enjoyed. The crowds of people that came to visit the exhibition here in Fitzgerald's Park. Again, evidence from the 1902 exhibition, from the various brochures that they produced around that. The hotel and hospitality sector was vibrant in Cork. So people obviously would have bought, if they had the money, would have bought the finest clothing, the finest foods. They would have enjoyed balls, regattas, all the trappings of the upper classes. Sports would have been indulged in, pastimes, hunting, fishing. People have Downton Abbey in their mind. These are the lifestyles. So probably one of the biggest things that people kind of forget about the burgeoning Cork City at the time was the introduction of the better transport systems, and the tram was definitely one of them, and that facilitated rich people who could move to the suburbs. So by 1902, the vast majority of people who lived in Cork City Centre were generally poorer.
There were tiers, I would say, there were tiers of society really, and in terms of the level, at the bottom level, people eking out an existence. It was there, I suppose, that people were drawn into the nationalist cause then from various reasons, that they had hoped ultimately that the new state or whatever would bring them, that if they had their own destiny in their hands, life could only get better because it could hardly get any worse.
By 1920, however, the rule of law had broken down in Cork. The RIC had lost its capacity to tackle insurgents throughout the county. This was the reason for the arrival of a paramilitary force recruited in Britain and comprised of former officers, many of them unemployed after the war. They were known as the RIC Auxiliaries. When they arrived in Cork, few could have imagined what they were about to unleash on the city. The auxiliaries of K Company were about to commit one of the most shocking attacks of the War of Independence. In 1920, a major turning point had been reached. Cork City elected its first Republican Lord Mayor, Tomás McCurtain, who promised not just social change, but even more armed conflict.
One of the first things McCurtain did when he became Lord Mayor was set up a committee to look at improving wages and living conditions in Cork.
Although Cork wasn't part of the 1916 Rising, the events and developments afterwards, including an attempt to conscript Irishmen into the British Army for war, and the Sinn Féin local elections of 1919, fuelled nationalist fervour. A landmark event was the killing of McCurtain in 1920. His replacement as IRA commander and Lord Mayor, Terence McSweeney, died on hunger strike a matter of months later. The execution of Kevin Barry and Bloody Sunday in Dublin caused even greater national tension. Back in Cork, the Kilmichael IRA ambush that killed 17 auxiliaries and 3 IRA men in West Cork was a seismic event on November the 28th. Colonel Gerald Smith, the Munster Police Commissioner, had issued chilling instructions to men in his division.
When civilians approach, shout "Hands up!" Should the order not be obeyed, shoot, and shoot with effect. If any persons approaching you carry their hands in their pockets or are in any way suspicious looking, shoot them down. You may make mistakes occasionally and innocent persons may be shot, but you're bound to get the right persons sometimes. The more you shoot, the better I will like you. And I assure you that no policeman will get in trouble for shooting any man, and I guarantee your names will not be given at the inquest.
Of the estimated 115,000 IRA volunteers during the War of Independence, 16% of them, or almost 18,000, served in Cork City. They were responsible for a fifth of the killings of RIC men and for almost a third of military fatalities. Such lawlessness didn't go unanswered by the authorities. By late 1920, gunfire was a nightly occurrence in the city, as were attacks in the countryside. After another attack on an auxiliary patrol at Dillon's Cross in Cork City on the night of December 11th, the city itself would become the latest reprisal target.
20 men for a raid. Left the barracks in 2 motor cars. Party hadn't gone 100 yards from the barracks when 2 bombs were thrown at them from over a wall. One dropped in a car and wounded 8 men. One has since died. Very naturally, the rest of the company were enraged.
The fact that another ambush had taken place so close to the barracks, such audacity, I think that the auxiliaries believed that a message was being sent to them and they were going to send a message back. So the fact that there was a response was entirely predictable and expected. The scale of the response is unique.
The houses in the vicinity of the ambush were set alight. The burning and sacking of Cork followed immediately.
We had a big run up to Christmas. You can imagine that all these shops would have been decked out as well in all their finery, their Christmas finery at the time. We can see by the advertisements, the jewellery shops were very much in vogue. You had the big department stores, and of course they were selling hats and coats. First thing that they done was they attacked the buildings, obviously. They usually took down the hoardings. There was an awful lot of shops had hoardings over them because there'd been a lot of trouble in the city previously. And they'd have broken the windows of the buildings. More often than not, they used petrol. In some cases, they used incendiary devices. And it was just total pandemonium. They started with grants. The amount of petrol that was incredible that was actually used. And we're talking here about the auxiliaries, we're talking about the Black and Tans and some members of the RIC. The next one to be set on fire would have been the Munster Arcade. That was a Belfast firm, Robert Ledley Ferguson. So these had been seen as loyalists. These were Unionists. You'd see from old pictures of the city, Union Jacks flying outside these buildings. So that will just give you an indication. It wasn't Republican buildings that were being burnt. And the next one then after that was Cash's. I mean, this was a big department store, a huge department store. Pandemonium must have ensued at the time. Oh, there was extensive looting. I mean, black and tans, auxiliaries that were seen marching up and down the street with bags of loot. They had bags and bags of loot.
The looting takes place first. There's an attempt to target shops which have, as it were, high value, low volume, so things like jewellers. There's also a focus on the public houses, and it's only after that point that the arson takes place. So again, this reinforces the suggestion that the acts were premeditated, the fact that petrol is equipped, the fact that there's a determined effort to prevent the fire brigade from putting out the fires, again suggests that either there was a determined effort simply to allow the city to burn, or with the added motive of destroying any evidence.
I mean, there would have to be an awful lot of terror in the people as well, because no one knew which building was going to be fired on next. As the night wore on, there was more and more drink consumed by these people. Again, there's reports of black and tans with bottles of brandy in their pockets.
The auxiliaries were simply determined to leave their mark, destructive or otherwise.
And they could act with impunity.
Absolutely, and did act with impunity. To the extent to which any punishments took place, they were absolutely minimal in proportion to the damage that had been inflicted.
We have again first-hand account from William Roach of Roach's Stores, and he tells us that these buildings had apprentices overhead, and they lived in very, very cramped conditions. So in some of these buildings you had 15 and maybe more apprentices upstairs.
So it's remarkable that people weren't killed in the fires.
It's absolutely it's miraculous really that nobody was killed on the night.
But by 12:30, the whole southern side of Patrick Street was just one massive flame. Certainly, a brigade the size of Cork in 1920 had no hope of containing a fire that size.
Hoses were being slashed, firemen were being shot at by the auxiliaries and the black and tans at the time.
By the middle of the night, the Republican-controlled City Hall across the River Lee became a target. So too did Cork's only free library, paid for by the American philanthropist Andrew Carnegie.
The firemen returned with some equipment and attempted to turn hoses on the burning City Hall, and each time they turned on the water was turned off by a party of policemen under an inspector. And when the fire service members remonstrated with the inspector, he was told that he had no control over the policemen.
I have never experienced such orgies of murder, arson and looting as I have witnessed during the past 16 days with the RIC auxiliaries. Many who witnessed similar scenes in France and Flanders say that nothing they had experienced was comparable to the punishment meted out in Cork.
By the time the ruins of Cork City could be properly examined, some £2 million worth of damage had been caused, the equivalent of 58 million euros today, and at least 2,000 jobs were lost. What began as a spree of violence and arson would lead to the complete devastation of a city, leaving its bewildered population to survey what was left of it. Join us after the break when we'll hear how Cork was rebuilt as the city we know today. You're very welcome back to Nationwide. On the morning after some 5 acres of Cork city centre was razed, a small and exhausted team of firemen faced a seemingly endless shift to save what they could. Their senior officer, Alfred Hudson, was in his 70s. He pleaded for much needed assistance.
Dublin Fire Brigade dispatched a motor pump by special train from Kingsbridge later on in the Sunday evening. and the Dublin contingent arrived into Cork about 1:30 in the morning. They were under the command of their chief, Captain Myers, and he later said that in his opinion, Cork city centre was worse than O'Connell Street had been after the Easter Rising in 1916.
The first big thing that had to happen was the rubble had to be cleared. I mean, the whole street here would have been covered in rubble. The big problem was falling buildings.
The rebuilding of the city would take years, but within a matter of weeks, if not days, several business owners were back trading in a limited way.
We can see the temporary premises, the temporary huts that are put up. Well, one of the reasons that the huts were put up very quickly because they had to establish their claim on the property. Because boundary lines were gone. I mean, the shop next to you was gone. What were you going to take your line off of? And that caused a lot of hassle in some cases because some shops had encroached on other people's property. A lot of people looked at the main buildings of the city. Cash's, Munster Arcade, Egan's, but it was all the smaller premises. We had dentists, hairdressers, engravers, photographers. They all lost their business. With the rebuilding of the city then, the City Council Corporation at the time, they decided they wanted to change the layout of the street. So they offered compensation to the different shops if they lost some of their frontage. But as well as that, the corporation wanted to get rid of some of the laneways. Like Robert Street at the time was one of those targets. Winthrop Street was supposed to be widened, and the people in the shops and in the businesses actually came out against that. So we still retained those wonderful lanes in the city.
It's reported that William Roach of Roach's Stores had a fire sale shortly after the burning. He was quick to hatch plans to realise his dream of a grand department store and began to acquire adjacent properties.
A lot of the buildings, when they were rebuilt of Little Island limestone.
And local traders insisted on that.
Oh yeah, the Trades Association was involved, the unions were involved, and they wanted people back up and working in the city. They wanted local labour, they wanted local people, because there was up to 6,000 people unemployed as a result of the fires in the city.
By the mid-1930s, compensation for the burning of Cork had finally been paid by the British government, which had initially refused to accept responsibility. The first council meeting in the new City Hall was held in 1935, but the Carnegie Library was never rebuilt. Thanks to a far-sighted city manager, Philip Monaghan, work had earlier begun to eradicate slum conditions in the city, and public housing enjoyed a boom. Cork was finally emerging from its grim past.
By the 30s, they were beginning to clear the lanes and start building council housing that gave space and gardens and that to people who were going to move into them. And it was those families then whose children really got the opportunities in the late 50s, early 60s to, stay on in school, do something else, try to be educated for a career or some kind of profession.
And on another positive note, I'm not from Cork, but I get a sense that community spirit that was engendered at the time is still here to a degree.
It is, and I mean, I suppose as we're talking about the downside of it, it was such a lovely place to grow up in those streets, in that people did look out for each other, they did care about one another, and in many ways, someone else's mother stepped in for yours if she wasn't around. That it was, in a way, that it was as if they tolerated and rose above the conditions, but created this warmth of human existence among themselves.
Spirit of Cork still
Spirit
here.
of Cork, and it's still, it is, Donal. I mean, it's still at its heart a big town as opposed to a city. People won't thank me for saying that, but it's true,
What we do have that stands testimony to the city is the magnificent buildings that were put up in their place by local trades. Local stone was used, and it's a great credit to the city that we have these wonderful buildings.
You're obviously proud of your city. Remarkably, no one was killed in the fires. Elsewhere in Cork that night, the usual suspects were being sought out following the earlier Dillon's Cross ambush. Two they found were brothers, well known for their IRA activities in the city, Jeremiah and Con Delaney. Their father answered a knock at their farmhouse door in the middle of the night.
My grandfather went down and answered the door. They asked him, was this the Delaney house? And he said yes. And were the Delaney's sons here? And he said yes. And they asked to be taken to the bedroom, which he did. He went up the stairs and took them to the bedroom where my uncles Con and Ger were sleeping. And they immediately told them to get out of bed, which they did, and they stood, and they were both shot immediately. Then they also shot their uncle, William Dunley, who was staying with them.
They were in the movement, particularly the two boys, Con and Jeremiah, were volunteers. They were members of the Cork No. 1 IRA Brigade. So it wouldn't have been unknown that if an incident had happened in the locality, that they, you know, if you like, the spotlight was on them. So that would be the raison d'etre for the boys knocking at the door. But what happened afterwards was just a whole line was crossed in the savagery that went on.
The burning of Cork was a seismic event, but the War of Independence wasn't over yet.
There certainly isn't the level of punishment that one would expect, bearing in mind what had occurred. The British came to realise that it was simply impossible to stop their troops from undertaking these type of operations, either because they were ignoring their officers or the officers were complicit in them. So in order to maintain some degree of the semblance of top-down military command, a policy of official reprisals was introduced, and this is implemented with particular severity in County Cork. So I think that's, in terms of the direct legacy of the burning of Cork, that's one of the most important.
It also shocked the world.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the most substantial pieces of, as it were, urban arson between the end of the First World War and Kristallnacht in Germany in the 1930s. To have the forces of law and order behaving in such a destructive, illegal manner was something that the British government simply couldn't deny. What it did do, of course, was to suppress the official report into the burning, which found a number of individuals guilty, as well as the commanding officer.
But that report was buried.
That report was buried. And if one has a look at the cabinet discussion, the reason it's given, and very frankly, is that this would have a devastating impact upon the British position and upon the morale of troops. So the British don't hesitate to suppress bad news, as it were, if it didn't suit. The British government take this as a sign that they're winning, and this policy of coercion should be persisted with. And so, if anything, the intensity of the British operations, which are then matched by the IRA operation, goes up several notches in the first 6 months of 1921. But Cork and Ireland generally had a lot more to suffer, even after the burning of Cork, before the guns fell silent.
This weekend, public events will remind people of a time when Cork resembled a city without a future. For now, it's good to see the city return to its bustling pre-Christmas self. That's all from Nationwide for this evening, and thank you for watching.
On next Friday's Nationwide, a visit to Doolin in County Clare to see how the locals kept the music going during COVID times. And on Inisheer, we meet a teacher whose images captured this unique landscape during lockdown.